Good evening. I have to say that I am delighted to be at Quinnipiac. It's my first visit. I had forgotten how beautiful Connecticut is. I live in Brooklyn, by the way, and it's a gorgeous campus. This is the first public appearance that I have made since I had knee surgery last May. So I may need to alternate standing and sitting, because I've learned that if I'm standing, I'm usually standing only on one leg, and it gets uncomfortable at a certain point. Nothing's very comfortable when your knee doesn't work. I have so many good friends in Connecticut, some of whom are here tonight. One of them is the great Connecticut blogger, John Pelto. Another is a teacher whom I consider my confidant and first responder who gives me the news before it's been published, Linda Hall. And then I have such friends as Wendy Lecker, who writes for the Stamford Advocate, and Sarah Dara Littman, who writes as the Connecticut News Junkie, and so many more, and they keep me so well informed about what's happening in this wonderful state. I want first of all to thank the teachers and the administrators of Connecticut's public schools, because by every measure, you have one of the best public school systems in the nation. On the National Assessment of Educational Progress, on whose board I sat for 7 years, it's been comparing states since 1992. Connecticut always ranks second or third in the nation in both reading and mathematics. This is outstanding performance. You have a great school system, great teachers, great administrators, and as we saw so tragically at Newtown, your educators are ready to lay down their lives for their children. How dare anyone insult them? We know that where test scores are low, there's high poverty. And what needs to be done? We know what needs to be done. We need to improve the schools, not replace them. We need to reduce class sizes. We need to provide the children with the extra teachers and the extra resources that they need to learn. The state should be creating economic development to lift their families out of poverty, not closing their schools and decimating their communities. Why don't we learn from the top performing nations in the world? They have strong and equitable public school systems. They do not have charters and they do not have vouchers. They spend more on children in need than on children in affluence. They have a respected education profession. No amateurs are allowed as teachers, principals, or superintendents, or state superintendents. And they make sure that their students have access to medical care, food, and shelter. It's part of education, is healthy children. We know what makes good schools: caring families, experienced educators, a responsible school board, a curriculum that includes not only the basic skills, but the arts, foreign languages, history, civics, foreign and physical education, up-to-date technology, reasonable class sizes, a community united to support its local public schools. We know what matters most to parents. They want their children well educated. They want them to have good character and ethical behavior. They want them to be healthy and safe and happy. They want them to have the skills and the knowledge to prepare for life. And yet we have federal and state policies that focus on one thing and one thing only: test scores. Test scores have become the be-all and the end-all, not only here in Connecticut, but everywhere in the United States, thanks to No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. The policymakers are obsessed with test scores and data. They're prepared to sacrifice children, public schools, and learning itself. They love data more than they love children. They love data more than they love learning. They love data. They don't care much about curiosity or imagination. All of this is wrong, and we must say it's wrong. We must protest. We must demand better. Our children and our society deserve so much more. The word reform itself has become suspect because it is so often used to describe negative, punitive, and failed policies that ignore the root causes of low test scores. Today, reform means school choice. It means budget cuts. It means firing teachers, firing librarians, guidance counselors, nurses, school psychologists, social workers, closing public schools, turning public dollars over to private managers, into entrepreneurs, into sports stars, into celebrities, and pretending that test scores are the most important outcome of schooling. Last year, a 12-year-old child died of an asthma attack in a Philadelphia public school because of budget cuts. The school nurse was available only 2 days a week, and the child got sick on a day when there was no school nurse, and that's called reform. The people who now call themselves reformers don't object to budget cuts. We never hear them complain when the governor cuts $1 billion out of the school budget, as the governor did in Michigan, as the governor did in Pennsylvania, as the legislature did in Texas, where they cut $5.3 billion out of the school budget while giving a $500 million contract to Pearson for more testing. Reformers don't object to segregation. They even boast about their segregated charter schools. They don't object to larger class sizes. They actually think that larger class sizes are fine because it saves money. They don't complain about excessive testing. They don't worry about child poverty. It doesn't bother them when you tell them that successful charter schools exclude children with severe disabilities and English language learners. They don't complain about charter schools that operate for profit. They don't object when billions of dollars in public funds are diverted to consultants, investors, technology entrepreneurs, and testing companies instead of funding the arts, reducing class size, and providing the necessary social services that children need. Many educators today feel that they have become public enemies. State after state is treating its teachers with disrespect, taking steps that harm the profession, threatening their right to due process. In some states, it seems as though the elimination of public education is the goal of school reform. But this is not reform. This is a toxic attack on public education and on democracy itself. So I want to talk a bit about hoaxes. When I brought out the paperback edition of Reign of Error, they asked if I would write a new afterword, and I devoted a new afterword to the hoaxes, because I discovered it wasn't just the hoax of privatization, but a whole panoply of hoaxes. I write about these in both Death and Life of the Great American School System and in Reign of Error. And it begins, you could take it back 30 years to A Nation at Risk that predicted that our country was on the verge of extinction because of low international test scores. That was 1983, and guess what? We've surpassed all of the other nations that were competing against us at that point who had higher test scores. But the hoax that I want to begin with is No Child Left Behind. There is no one who can say that No Child Left Behind left no child behind. It was a ridiculous law. It was based on the Texas miracle. George W. Bush, when he was running for president, boasted that tests and accountability had brought about higher graduation rates, higher test scores, and had narrowed the achievement gap between children from different racial groups. But it was all a hoax. Setting a goal of proficiency for all by the year 2014 was a hoax. No nation in the world has achieved that. And I remember at the time the law was passed, I went to a panel discussion at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., and my former boss, who had been Secretary of Education, now Senator Lamar Alexander, was on the panel, and I was in the audience. And I asked at the end of the panel discussion, as they were talking about what a great law this was and how it was going to raise all children, and I said, Senator Alexander, do you really believe that all children will be proficient in reading and math by the year 2014? And he said, well, actually, no, we don't believe that, Diane, but we do believe it's good to have goals. Well, based on those goals, many schools have been closed. I don't know how many. I know it's way more than the hundreds. It's probably in the thousands of public schools have been closed based on a fictitious goal that no one actually believed in when it was passed. Race to the top is a hoax. $4.35 billion was offered up to states that were willing to open up more charter schools, that were willing to funnel more public money to entrepreneurs, that were willing to close public schools as part of a turnaround, most of them in minority communities, to promote more teaching to the test, and to force states to judge teachers by the test scores of their students. There's no evidence behind any one of these propositions, just as there was no evidence behind any part of No Child Left Behind, including the sanctions included in No Child Left Behind. The race to the top has compelled almost every state to adopt the Common Core standards, which have never been tested anywhere or had never been tested anywhere. And now that they have begun to be tested, we know that they cause a collapse in the passing rates wherever they are tested. The architect of the Common Core is an entrepreneur who never taught. In fact, on the writing committee, there were no classroom teachers. The architect of the Common Core, David Coleman, attended Yale and Oxford, a very brilliant man. He worked at McKinsey Consulting. He's now the president of the College Board, aligning the SAT with the Common Core, so you can't escape. The testing industry was very well represented on the writing committee of the Common Core. Today, Common Core is highly controversial, and it deserves to be. The research behind it is flimsy to non-existent. There is no evidence that high standards produces high test scores. There is no evidence that national standards lead to high test scores. The lowest performing nations in the world have national standards. National standards do not produce high achievement. High test scores are not the same thing as good education. Why? And this is the question that we should have been asking for the past several years, since 2009. Why are we racing to the top? What is the top, and what does it mean to win? Why do we want schools to produce winners and losers? The promise of American public education is equality of educational opportunity, and not a market-based system where a few win and are at the top of the mountain and everyone else loses. The very narrative that's called reform today is itself a hoax. The hoax says, or the reformers say, our schools are failing, our schools are broken, our schools are obsolete. We've heard this again and again. The American public's heard it again and again. They've heard it now since A Nation at Risk in 1983. But it's wrong. And in Reign of Error, I went to the U.S. Department of Education website and reproduced from their website their own graphs that show that test scores today are not flat, they're not declining, they're the highest they've ever been in history. And I'm not talking about looking between yesterday and today or yesterday and last year. I'm looking at 40-year trends. Look at the 40-year trend, and the test scores today are the highest they've ever been for American students in the past 40 years. And they've gone up steadily really over the entire 20th century. And that is that they're the highest ever for white students, black students, Hispanic students, and Asian students. The reformers tell us that the graduation rates are a scandal. Well, that's a hoax, too. Graduation rates have never been higher than they are today for all of these groups. And then we hear again and again, to the point of over-repetition, that there's a dropout crisis. Well, in fact, the dropout rate today is the lowest it's ever been for white students, black students, Hispanic students, and Asian students. You can't have the courage to go on when people tell you that everything you do has failed, when in fact it hasn't failed. Our educational system is not failing, it's not obsolete, and it's not broken. You will hear, and we have heard many times over the past several years, we're losing the international competition. This is wrong. You know why? Because the test scores of 15-year-olds don't mean anything. They predict nothing. In the first international assessment, which was given in 1964, 12 nations competed. We came in dead last. And in the 50 years that followed, we outperformed economically, technologically, culturally, and in every other way the other 11 nations. The test scores of the 15-year-olds did not predict our future. America's trump card has always been freedom, creativity, originality, innovation, ingenuity. Standardized tests reward those who are able to pick the right box. Those who pick the right box will be excellent clerks. For the 21st century, what we must do is to teach students to think outside the box, not to get the right answer, but to ask the right questions and to question the right answer. The jurisdiction with the highest test scores in the world is Shanghai, followed closely by other East Asian nations and cities. I urge you to read Yang Zhao's new book, which is called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Why China Has the Best and the Worst Education System in the World. And Yang Zhao, who's now a professor at the University of Oregon, was educated in China, and he says China has the best system in the world because it has the highest test scores. It has the worst system in the world because it purchases those test scores by sacrificing creativity, originality, ingenuity, and the freedom to think. It's an authoritarian system, and we are trying to copy it. And the whole message of his book is, don't copy China. China needs to break free of this lockstep rote memorization focus on test scores, and the worst thing we can do to compete with them is to copy them. So I'll repeat the name of the book because I hope you'll all read it. It's called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Now, the achievement gap obviously concerns Connecticut as it concerns all of us, but we should look back to when was the time when the achievement gap narrowed the most? It was in the late 1970s and in the early 1980s. And we must ask ourselves, why did the achievement gap narrow then? What was happening then? There was an emphasis on desegregation, which we have almost completely abandoned. There was increased economic opportunity for African American families. There was a push for class size reduction, and there was a push for early childhood education. Now, if these are the things that were concurrent with the reduction of the achievement gap, shouldn't we be trying to do more of those things instead of privatizing schools? We do have a crisis in cities where there is a combination of poverty and racial segregation. Charter schools do not address either poverty or racial segregation. What they do is to encourage the super rich among us to think that there's a cheap solution that does not involve higher taxes on them. It is a hoax to believe that the private sector does it better. We hear this again and again. The private sector does it better, but it doesn't. The private sector operates by seeking to cut costs, to have the lowest wage workers. This may produce cheaper products, but it doesn't produce good education. It's a hoax to believe that the for-profit sector will produce innovation in education. The so-called innovative charters look incredibly like 19th century schools, especially for black children. They're taught to obey, to conform, to walk in a straight line, or to be suspended. The private sector practices risk management. Their idea is sort of like the stock market. You sell off the low-performing stocks, and you keep the high-performing stocks. So you close down low-performing schools and you open new ones and hope for the best. And then you close them down if they don't perform better. This is known as a portfolio district. I think New Haven's doing that. Charters are not subject to the same accountability as public schools. You've seen that in Connecticut, where you learn, much to your surprise, that one of the high-flying charter schools had a doctor leading it who was not a doctor and who had a criminal background because the state didn't do criminal background checks on people in charter schools. Charters are neither accountable nor transparent. Reformers are destroying the teaching profession. This is not what's happening in the high-performing nations. They require well-prepared teachers. In Finland, it takes 5 years to become a teacher. We need higher standards to become a teacher, not lower standards. In some states, charters are permitted to hire uncertified teachers. This does not elevate the profession. It's another hoax to believe that young college graduates with only 5 weeks of training, that is Teach for America, are just as good as or better than experienced teachers. That's not true. Teach for America sends the false message that experience and professional training don't matter. But what we know is that most of them will be gone after 2 years or 3 years. And churn is not good for children, not good for schools, not good for families. There is no such thing as Teach for Finland. The idea that teachers can be evaluated by the test scores of their students is a hoax perpetrated by Race to the Top and the Gates Foundation. Test-based evaluation has not worked anywhere. It has been disproven by experience and by research. It's invalid, it's unstable. You can get the same results by the roll of the dice or the flip of a coin. You cannot identify great teachers based on their students' test scores. You are measuring who is in their class. Teachers of special education, teachers of English language learners, and teachers of the gifted will see small gains. Why teachers of the gifted? Their kids are already at the top. They can't go anywhere further. Teachers in affluent districts are likely to look like great teachers because they will get the gains. This is a ridiculous approach, and it's not used in any other country that I've been able to discover because it has disruptive effects on teachers, on schools, and it's really, truly stupid. The effort that we now see to abolish due process rights, aka tenure for teachers, is a hoax. I assume you're aware of the Vergara decision in California, where a judge said that the very idea of tenure shocks the conscience. Well, he seems to have a very tender conscience because teachers in affluent districts, teachers in high-scoring districts have tenure, as do teachers in low-performing districts, and the performance of the students is not caused by the tenure of their teachers or the lack thereof. Without due process rights, teachers will not have academic freedom. Who will teach evolution in large sectors of this country? Who will teach global warming? Who will teach Huckleberry Finn? Who will teach Invisible Man? There have been teachers that have been fired for daring to teach these subjects in states that don't have tenure. One complaint from a parent and the teacher's job is on the line. The lawsuits challenging teachers' due process rights will be decided by judges who hold lifetime tenure. They should give it up. The cases will be argued by academics who have lifetime tenure. When Raj Chetty, a critic of tenure, gives up his tenure at Harvard, when Lawrence Tribe gives up his tenure at Harvard Law School, I will believe that they don't believe in tenure. They believe in it for themselves, but not for teachers. Another hoax is merit pay. There's been a century of attempts to show that merit pay can work. It has never worked. It does not produce higher test scores. The definitive examination of merit pay was done at Vanderbilt University. It was in Nashville. Teachers were offered $15,000. They were fifth grade teachers of mathematics, $15,000 to produce higher test scores. And they had a control group and an experimental group. And at the end of 3 years, when the economist examined the evidence, they found that the offer of $15,000 as a reward made no difference. Both groups got the same test scores. How could that be? Because the teachers were teaching the best they knew how. They didn't know how to teach any harder or any better. They were not hiding their secret ways of teaching, waiting for a bonus. Another hoax that's become repeated and popular over the past several years is the claim that poverty is just an excuse for poor teachers. But poverty is the single most reliable predictor of test scores. And if you want to see evidence of that, look at the latest release of the SAT scores, where they include a graph in which they show the test scores of students in relationship to the income of their family. And it's a stair step. It's very regular. At the lowest end of the stair step are the children whose families earn below $25,000 a year. And then it goes up with every increment in income. It goes up and up and up to over $200,000 a year. The gap between the lowest end and the highest end on the SAT is 400 points. And it's correlated with the income of the family. It really hurts academic performance when children don't have food on the table. It really hurts when they don't know if they have a home to go to. It really hurts when they have asthma, when they never get dental care, when they never have screening for vision, when they have hearing problems and don't know what the teacher said. The United States, to our shame, leads the advanced nations of the world in child poverty. This is the #1 problem of our time. Both charters and vouchers directly weaken public schools, taking away funding and sending it to privately run schools. The reformers say that they are saving poor kids from failing schools, but it isn't true. Charter research shows that some charters get high scores, some get low scores. There are some very good charters that are doing a good job and should continue to be in business. But we're seeing in the charter industry, in the charter sector, the same thing that's happening in the rest of our economy. The chains are snapping up the charter business, and they're growing by leaps and bounds. And the mom and pop charters are struggling in the face of the charter chains, the Walmarts of charters. In many states, the lowest performing schools are charters. The high performing charters have frequently, usually, low numbers of English language learners, low numbers of students with disabilities, and they have high attrition. Some of the highest performing charter schools, there's not a single child with serious disabilities. They're counseled out. In some of them, there's not a single child who doesn't read English. This is wrong. Charters say that they're public schools, but not when it comes to complying with state laws. They're exempt from state labor laws. They're exempt from certification requirements. They're exempt from discipline regulations. In some states, they refuse to be audited, even though they're getting public money, because they say that they are private corporations. In California, last year, a couple running a charter school was convicted of misusing $200,000. And the charter said, but we're not public schools. We can't be held accountable, and we can't be convicted under these laws. We are private contractors. Well, tough, they're in jail. So what we see in state after state is, as I said, the growth of unaccountable charters, and where there are for-profit charters, it's pretty scary stuff. Ohio has a charter chain called White Hat. It's the largest chain in the state. The owners of the White Hat chain, an industrialist from Akron, gives huge political contributions, runs terrible schools that get D's and F's, and he's never held accountable, and his schools are never closed. Ohio has spent over $1 billion on charters in just the past decade. There are more failing charters than there are failing public schools. They disrupt children's lives, they destroy communities, and they waste millions of dollars that will never be recovered. Right now in Ohio, there's a lawsuit going on because the White Hat charter chain says that anything they purchase with public money belongs to their private corporation. So if they choose to close the school and to move, all of the possessions of the school bought with public money belongs to the private corporation, not to the public. What public school would say that? That's crazy. In Florida, there are nearly 600 charters, and they're a very powerful political force. They give a lot of money to elected officials. Charter advocates had major committees in the legislature. This year, all the capital funding went to charters and not a dollar to public schools. Many of these schools are for-profit. Schools open, schools close. Millions are invested, millions are lost. There have already been 250 charters closed and others that took their place. There's one family in South Florida that has accumulated over $100 million in real estate from public funds just for opening charter schools. There's a rapper named Pitbull who is a member of that family, and he's starting his own charter school where I hope they don't read the lyrics to his songs. Vice President Joe Biden's brother, Frank Biden, runs a for-profit charter chain in Florida. Charter Schools USA, a for-profit chain, has given $200,000 in political contributions in the past year. In the 2012 state races, charter corporations gave nearly $2 million to state races. This is just buying influence. Same story is found in state after state. In Chicago, the largest charter chain is called UNO. It's run by a very politically connected Hispanic gentleman, or it was. It got $98 million from the state legislature to build more charters. The guy who opened UNO was the campaign chairman for Rahm Emanuel when he was running for mayor. But when it turned out that most of the contracts were given to friends and relatives, he had to resign because of the conflicts of interest. There are some states that still have conflict of interest laws. In Michigan, 80% of the charters are run for profit. There are entire districts that have been handed over to for-profit corporations. Interestingly enough, every district that's been handed over to a for-profit corporation is an almost completely black school district. The Detroit Free Press ran a series just a few weeks ago saying the state is giving now $1 billion a year to charter schools, and they perform no better than public schools, and they have no accountability. Well, one could go on and on with the stories of the rappers and the athletes, people like Andre Agassi, who's a high school dropout who now has his own charter chain. It's almost inexplicable. I don't think that other countries can understand why we're doing this. Vouchers have been an immense hoax. Milwaukee has had vouchers since 1990. Cleveland has had them since 1996. The District of Columbia since 2003. There have been no academic gains accruing to the children who had vouchers. No voucher plan has ever been enacted by voters. They have been imposed by legislatures. Now, there was an evaluation done in Milwaukee, and the evaluators, who were very pro-voucher, said, they're from the University of Arkansas, also known as the University of Walton. But the evaluators said, well, it's true there were no academic gains, but look at the graduation rate. The graduation rate's higher if kids have a voucher. But it also said that the attrition rate in Milwaukee voucher schools was 56%. So if you're part of the 44% that make it to graduation, you're likelier to graduate than if you were in public school. But most of the kids are gone by then. Well, the voucher advocates say, okay, they don't do any worse than public schools. Well, yes, they do. They take public funds away from public schools and fund religious education, which has never been allowed in this nation until just recently. Just this morning, I blogged about what's happening in North Carolina, where they just passed vouchers, and the school that got the largest number of vouchers is the Greensboro Islamic Academy. Now, do you think those conservative Christians who enacted vouchers expected that most of them would go to an Islamic academy? I mean, the founders were far wiser than we are. Will we really increase our supply of scientists if we expand the number of schools that teach biblical theories of the creation of the universe? I don't think so. There's also this idea that competition will make schools improve. If that were true, Milwaukee would be the highest performing city in the country. It's had vouchers and charters now since 1990. But it's one of the lowest performing districts in the country. Its scores on the NAEP slightly above Detroit. Very, very low performance and lots of competition. There's also this notion, and you find it particularly among legislators, that if kids can't pass the test, make the test harder. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. If you can't jump over a 4-foot bar, why would you raise it to 6 feet? You can't do that. It doesn't make any sense. I have this idea about testing. I would like to see the people who pass the laws take the test.
That too.
And publish their scores. And if you're not willing to take the test, don't pass those laws. There's also the hopes that testing is the way to measure school quality. It's commonplace today. But testing is not a measure of school quality. Testing is an accurate measure of family income and family education. Every standardized test in the world shows achievement gaps between the haves and the have-nots. We are the most over-tested nation in the world. No other nation tests every child in every grade from 3 through 8. Now we come to the Common Core. And somebody said to me earlier at a reception, you haven't criticized the Common Core. And I said, stand by. We've been told that the Common Core is needed for global competition. We've heard from Jeb Bush and Michelle Rhee and Joel Klein and Condoleezza Rice that our national security is at stake if we don't have the Common Core. This is crazy. How do they know that when there's no evidence? In New York, we've now tested twice on the Common Core. We've seen a dramatic drop in passing rates. Only 3% of English language learners passed the Common Core test. Only 5% of students with disabilities, less than 20% of African American and Hispanic students, and statewide, only 30% passed the Common Core test. Now, why did we get such terrible passing marks? The reformers want to say we're failing so that they can privatize more. Our state commissioner, who by the way comes from the charter sector, and the testing companies decided to raise the passing mark for the Common Core so high that they knew 70% of the kids would fail. This is failure by design. I can tell you from my 7 years on the NAEP board that the testing people know in advance exactly what percent of the kids are going to pass or fail a test because they set the passing mark. And the two Common Core testing consortia decided to align the passing mark with NAEP proficient. That's equivalent to aligning it with a grade of A. Do you expect that all children will get an A? Well, if we have massive grade inflation, all kids would get an A. But they knew in advance that 70% would fail the Common Core test. So what happens if year after year, 70% fail? What if it's only 68% who fail or 65%? What are we going to do with the kids who never get a high school diploma? What place is there for them in the society? I'm reminded of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, where there are alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons. And if you read the book, you know that children were sorted into these groups at conception in a test tube. We can do this with Common Core testing. And everyone will think they got their just desserts. We were once aspiring to be a land of opportunity where everyone had a chance to get ahead. Even if we didn't have that, we aspired to it. So we thought. But now our fates, the fates of our children and our grandchildren, will be decided by the test makers at Pearson and McGraw-Hill. That's wrong. Now, the biggest hoax of them all is the claim that school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. I'm old enough to remember that this was the agenda of the segregationists in the 1950s and the 1960s. George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, would be thrilled to know that the issue he championed is now the civil rights issue of our time. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would certainly not agree. We're expected to believe that it's a civil right to abandon public education and go shopping for a school. The goal of this narrative is to encourage people to think as consumers and not as citizens. Consumers look out for what's best only for themselves. Everyone has a right to choose a religious school or to choose an independent school so long as they pay for it. But wherever your children go to school, or even if you have no children at all, we all have a civic obligation to support public education. A free democratic society has a strong public sector and a strong private sector. Neither of them should be starved. We should have public libraries, public police protection, fire protection, protection of the air and water, public beaches, public parks, public roads. They should all be free and public, supported by all of us. Public education is a civic responsibility. It is not a consumer good. Now, I've been told that there's a billboard or a building in downtown Hartford that actually has that painted on the wall across the street from Steve Perry's charter school, or magnet school. It's been tweeted, and I didn't do it. Now, on our present course, we're on our way to creating a dual school system. 2 publicly funded systems. 1, privately managed, that can choose its students, exclude those it doesn't want, kick out those it doesn't want, make money on rentals and leases, and in some states, not this one, operate for profit. And the other system has to accept all children. That's segregation by class, even by race. Minneapolis has all black charters, all Hispanic charters, all Hmong charters, even all white charters. It's as though the Brown decision never happened. Now, what are the realities? I've gone through the hoaxes. The realities are these. Children start life with different advantages and disadvantages. Leveling the playing field is an obligation of society. Children don't create the world into which they're born. We create it, and it's our obligation to protect children. Schools can help, but they can't do it alone. There is an achievement gap that exists on the very first day of school. It starts in the home, where children are exposed to different opportunities, different vocabulary, different learning experiences. And there is so much we can do to change this. In my book, Reign of Error, I go through all of the research on this, but I began with something as simple as prenatal care. I mean, Bill Gates could take care of this and never even miss the money. The United Nations in March of Dimes did a survey and found that out of 184 nations, we were ranked number 131 in providing quality prenatal care to pregnant women. We were tied with Somalia. Shameful. We should provide high-quality early childhood education. The Economist ranked 45 nations. We came in 34th out of 45. These are more important statistics than the international test scores because these affect the lives of children. We should aim for reduced class sizes, especially in the early grades, and especially for those children who are having learning difficulties. All children should have a full, enriched curriculum, including the arts and physical education, and history and literature, and science, foreign languages. There should be medical care for all children whose parents cannot afford it. Every school should have access to a health clinic. Every school should have a school nurse. Schools need wraparound services, parent education, school psychologists, social workers, librarians, after-school programs, summer programs. Schools should be democratically controlled. I do not believe in mayoral control of schools. I've lived with it for enough years in New York City to say it disenfranchises the entire city. Charters should be designed for children who are not making it in public schools. Charters should be for children who are dropouts. Charters should boast of how many troubled children they've helped, not their test scores. Charters should be for the weakest students, not for the strongest. We should reduce poverty and racial segregation as a matter of public policy. Income inequality and wealth inequality today are at the highest point in our history. We are back to the age of the robber barons. Sometimes I think that this great debate that we're experiencing about school reform is actually a great distraction, intended to divert our eyes from the inequality that is shifting huge resources to the top 1%, or the top 1/10 of 1%, while more and more Americans struggle to survive and slip from the middle class into poverty. Why can't we have national goals to reduce segregation? Why do we accept segregation as inevitable? What if Arne Duncan had spent that $5 billion that he had to reward districts that developed real plans to encourage racial desegregation? We should strengthen the education profession. Teachers should have at least a year of professional education and practice teaching. Principals should be master teachers who can help their teachers. Superintendents should be experienced educators who understand teaching and learning. We should use tests diagnostically, not as carrots or sticks. Standardized tests should be used sparingly, preferably on a sampling basis, preferably not at all. The results of standardized tests come too late to be useful or helpful to students and teachers. In fact, these days, teachers are not even allowed to see how their students answered the questions and what they got right or wrong. That means that the standardized tests are totally useless. That means we're spending billions of dollars for totally useless tests. There's too much emphasis on testing. It narrows the curriculum only to what's tested. Most tests should be made by teachers. They know what they taught, and they can get the results instantly. Of course, teachers should be evaluated, but they should be evaluated based on their performance in the classroom. They should be evaluated by their peers and by their supervisors, and not by the test scores of their students. Schools that are struggling should get timely help, not closing. Maybe they need smaller classes for children who can't read. Maybe they need extra social workers. Maybe they need more bilingual instructors. But every school has different needs, and those needs should be evaluated and met. The purpose of education is not to race to higher test scores, but to prepare children to lead good lives, to prepare them for the duties and responsibilities of citizenship, to prepare them to vote, to serve on juries, to make wise decisions about themselves and about our society. What matters most is that we have schools where students learn to think about the consequences of their actions, where they learn to treat others with respect, and where they learn how to live and work in a world of rapid change, and where they gain the knowledge and skills that they need for their lives. Despite all of the hoaxes, despite all of the terrible things that are happening around the country, despite a federal policy that is misguided and harmful, I'm actually optimistic about the future. This so-called reform movement is built on a mountain of hyperbole and prevarication. Prevarication is actually a 5-syllable word that stands for lies. Parents are organizing, students are organizing. Students were organizing in Colorado to stop an out-of-control school board. Students have organized in Providence, Rhode Island. Students have organized in Portland, Oregon. The public is beginning to understand the effort to privatize their schools and to destroy the teaching profession. Frankly, whereas all the money's on the other side, we own social media. John Pelto, whom I mentioned before, has organized 150 education bloggers who support public education. And whether it's Twitter or blogging, we own social media, and that's how we communicate, and that's how we reach the public. The opt-out movement is growing, and I hope it continues to multiply to the point where nobody takes the test. I'm hopeful that in the spring of 2015 and the spring of 2016, we will see nationwide opt-outs by parents and by teachers saying enough is enough. Across the nation, grassroots groups are organizing in every state to take back public education and to protect children. Public education is a public trust. Teaching is a noble and sacred profession. Protecting our public schools against privatization and saving them for future generations of American children is the civil rights issue of our time. Thank you so much.